Welcome to this month at the TNM. March is a very important month in the history of Texas. The signing of the Texas Declaration of Independence happened on March 2nd, 1836. We still celebrate that date, and it's an opportunity to remember and celebrate the unique history and culture of Texas, as well as the bravery and sacrifices of those who fought for the state's independence. While there were many significant events that led to Texas becoming the Republic of Texas the first time, today we're privileged to have a leading scholar of the Alamo with us to give us some background on the Battle of the Alamo. Charles Turner is a lifelong Texan with a passion for our mission. He's dedicated his life to the profession of education, teaching young minds the truths about the world around them. After he retired from teaching, he saw what was happening to our nation and started working to save Texas from the rapid decline the United States was in. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk, becoming a candidate for state representative. Now, sit back and enjoy this presentation on remembering the Alamo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Charles Turner, and I am here to do a presentation on the Alamo. Remember the Alamo. Some of you may be new to Texas, and you may not understand the reverence that we have for the Alamo. It's almost like a religion. In fact, the Alamo occurred on a Sunday morning. And that particular morning, the battle was over by 6:30. In touring the battle site after the battle was over, Santa Anna mused that, well, it was but a small affair. In fact, his report to Mexico City was that he had lost 70 soldiers in the battle and that the Texans had lost 600. One of the first casualties of war is truth. In reality, yes, all 180 Texans lay dead. Even those who had attempted to surrender had been slain. But probably between 600 and 1,000 Mexican soldiers were also slain in the battle. So let's take a moment to go back and look at why this battle occurred. So let's go back to the building itself. San Antonio de Valero was a Franciscan mission, and it was commissioned in 1716 and 1718. The Franciscans came to the San Antonio area and they built the mission to minister to the local Indians in that area. Now, you may find it interesting to note that in 1724, the mission was destroyed, listen to me, by a hurricane. You know, all this climate change stuff must have been one whopper of a hurricane if it blew all the way into San Antonio and blew the mission down. But at that point, the mission was moved a few hundred yards, and that's where it is today. So it was moved to its final destination at that time. So we have the mission going on there, and in 1793, that mission was what they call secularized. That is, they determined that the Native Americans they were ministering to had integrated themselves into the population well enough that they no longer needed the mission. So all of the tools, the land, the seeds, all of that stuff was given to the locals, to the natives, and so forth. So the mission was at that time secularized. Notice I did not say that it was abandoned. It wasn't. It was merely used for other things. At one time, it was used as a hospital for the city of San Antonio. At other times, it was used as barracks for various military groups that came into the area. So it was never really abandoned, as you may have been led to believe. Now, the chapel, the thing that we most recognize as being the Alamo, was a project that the Franciscans had started. They intended to build a very beautiful church, but it never got finished and never had a roof. And that was that way when the Alamo occurred in 1836. Now, we move on up, and this business about people coming to Texas, Spain had a real problem in recruiting people to come to Texas. In fact, when the mission was built in 1718, part of the people that came in to populate that area were from the Canary Islands, and one of those families' name was Seguin. That name will come up again. But in the meantime, Spain offered a deal to men who would offer to bring in settlers to New Spain. One such man was Moses Austin. He made a deal with Spain with the help of Baron de Bastra to bring in 300 families. Unfortunately for Moses Austin, much like Moses in the Bible, he would never get to enter the promised land. He died, and Mexico won independence. In 1821, Mexico won what had been a very long war with Spain, achieving independence, and established a government based on an emperor. So that rocked on for a while. Now, Moses Austin allowed his son to take over the colonization project. And Stephen Austin was able to recruit 300 families that he brought into Texas. Now, keep in mind, he was not the only one bringing in families. There were others. Some groups recruited primarily from Mexico. Some recruited primarily from places in Europe, like Ireland, for example. So we have those different populations around in Texas that you can find roots of those going back even today. To complicate matters further, the people in Mexico really were not fond of having an emperor. So in 1824, they held a convention to write a constitution. Attending that constitution was a gentleman by the name of Erasmo Seguin. He was part of that family that had been brought in back in 1718. He was the only delegate from Texas to attend. So we have a constitution now that in many ways is similar to the Constitution of the United States. That rocks along for a few years until 1833, when a gentleman by the name of Santa Anna comes on the scene and is elected as president. Now, Santa Anna's been around for a while in the military. He was on both sides in almost every war he was involved in. He started out in the Mexican Revolution fighting for the crown, and then switched loyalty and fought for the rebels. So in 1833, he is elected president, and something that we would hope for, he immediately left the job in the hands of his vice president and went home. Had no desire to deal in the daily routine of governing. So he went home, and his vice president, along with the Congress, started passing some legislation that offended Santa Anna's supporters. So he comes back in, abolishes the Constitution of 1824, disbands the Congress, and takes complete control of the government in Mexico. Now, that offended quite a few people in Mexico. In fact, 15 of the 19 Mexican states rebelled against Santa Anna in some form. One of the main ones of those was the state of Zacatecas. It was a silver mining area, rather rich, and they had a very large militia that compared to the army that Santa Anna had. But on May the 11th in 1835, Santa Anna's army was able to defeat that militia, and in the aftermath of his victory, he released his troops on the city of Zacatecas for 48 hours. Some reports indicate that up to 2,000 civilians were murdered in the melee that followed. Needless to say, Santa Anna was not very popular in Zacatecas. Now, Santa Anna realized that he may have an issue in this little northern province, part of Texas and Coahuila in Texas, because there was a population of Anglos that were of concern. So he sent his brother-in-law, General Martin Perfecto de Cos to Texas to start handling that situation. Now, at about that same time, a company of dragoons went to the little town of Gonzales. You see, the Spanish government had given them a small cannon for protection against the Indians. And in Santa Anna's opinion, we needed to confiscate all the guns. Is any of this sounding familiar? So the Mexican cavalry arrived at Gonzales. They managed to delay until they could get a fairly large contingent of Texans on the scene. And in a battle that may be described as a skirmish, they were able to defeat the Mexicans and send them back to San Antonio and keep their cannons. At that point, the Texans began to move. They moved to Goliad, where there was a presidio, small fort. They were able to take that. No problem. They moved on from there to there, or San Antonio, laid siege to that area, and this is where General Cos has his headquarters. You see, San Antonio is a gateway to Texas. It was on the El Camino Real, the Royal Road. So all trails through Texas led through either there or through Goliad. We hold Goliad, we're working on San Antonio. So the Texans lay siege to there, and on December the 9th, General Cos surrendered, meaning that the Texans were now in control of San Antonio, and they removed Cos from the Alamo and took over all of the military supplies that were there. Now, Cos's men, we had no provision for taking prisoners, so Cos's men were, as they say at that time, paroled. They gave an oath that they would not come back and fight against the Texans. So they were paroled to go back home. Some of them actually stayed around, but they were paroled to go back home. And the Texans were kind enough to give every 10th man a musket and give them 3 or 4 cannons so they'd be able to protect themselves against, remember those Comanches? They were still around. So the Texans then set about working on that Alamo. Now, here's something that I want you to understand. You see in that little picture, lots of cannons. You see, this was the largest collection of artillery at that time west of the Mississippi River. Cannon were not cheap, and they were something to be protected. There were somewhere on the order of 18 or 20 artillery pieces there. Some of them came and went from time to time. But the Texans began to work on that fortification and get it prepared so that they would be able to hold it. Now, some of you may be sitting there and saying, because you remember that little thing in your history class, Sam Houston told them to abandon the post, didn't he? Kinda. He wrote a letter to the provisional governor, a man by the name of Henry Smith, suggesting that they abandon the Alamo, destroy what they couldn't take with them. Henry Smith was an avid independence supporter, and he rejected that notion, and in fact sent to Colonel Neal, the gentleman who had taken over command of the Alamo at this time, a letter reassuring him that when the need arose, reinforcements would arrive. So they had a promise. So they are reinforcing what they have. They are building and strengthening walls and all of those things. On February the 16th, 1836, Santa Anna came to the Rio Grande River. It was in the middle of a blizzard. Temperatures were down in the low teens and it was snowing. Keep in mind that many of these Mexican soldiers came from far south in Mexico, almost in the tropics. Quite a number of them froze to death because they were not equipped for weather like that. Oxen and mules died because of the heavy loads they were having to pull through the mud and the slush when this stuff melted. So it was a difficult crossing, but notice on February the 16th, he crossed into Texas, coming up the El Camino Real. Now, who would meet him when he got to San Antonio? That's where he was headed. So let's talk for a moment about some of these gentlemen. We all know William Travis, 26-year-old attorney from South Carolina. He had had some marital problems. In fact, he suspected his wife of being involved with another man and being pregnant with his child. There's some mention that the man met his death in some way. William Travis came to Texas looking for a new start. James Bowie. Everybody remembers the big knife. James Bowie was a knife fighter from Louisiana. He had dabbled in the slave trade. That's just part of what was going on. He was an acquaintance of Jean Lafitte, the pirate, and was known in Louisiana as a fighter, a frontiersman, and a kind of a ruffian kind of a guy. But he came to Texas in 1831. Got hooked up with a local family, became acquainted with them, married a young lady from that family. So he was married in, and he was very technically a Mexican citizen. He's a Mexican. Okay. David Crockett. You may all remember that he is the one, when he lost the election, told his audience, you may all go to hell. I will go to Texas. And when Crockett left his family, he assured them that he would send for them soon. You see, Crockett thought he would have a future in this new nation as a politician. He had that hope. Juan Seguin, remember those people that came in from the Canary Islands back in the very first days when the mission was built? Here he is, a great-grandson of those people that came in, and he was at the Alamo. No, he didn't die there. He would go on to fight in the Battle of San Jacinto because Travis sent him out as a courier. I believe because he knew of the value of this man. So Juan Seguin was there, a family that had been in Texas for a very long time. The Seguins, by the way, were of some French heritage. You may not have heard of James Bonham. You may have heard of the town of Bonham up in North Texas. James Bonham was 29 years old, a cousin of William Travis. He was also an attorney. And he came to Texas in November of 1835, set up his law firm, kind of got that going, was acquainted with Sam Houston, who thought highly of him, and commissioned him into the Texas Army. So on February the 23rd, Santa Anna's troops arrived at San Antonio, the lead elements coming into town.
We're going to need a lot more men.
Fire the 18-pounder.
The response was a round from the 18-pounder. So let's talk for a moment about the 18-pounder. Understand that artillery pieces were much the same then as they are now. We had rounds, and they had rounds that could blow things up, knock things down, and all of that. We also had ammunition that was designed specifically for personnel. Those are called grape shot. And it made the cannon into what amounted to being a very large shotgun. These were fired at very close range. This ball is documented to have come from the southwest wall of the Alamo. You'll take that? You're holding in your hand, you can pass it around. You're holding in your hand an object that was in the Alamo on March the 6th, 1836. Was it fired at anybody? I don't know. Again, these were fired at very close range, and if they were shooting down the walls as the Mexican soldiers tried to get over those walls, there's a possibility that it could have been in the wall, because it's claimed that that ball was dug from the southwest wall in 1860 by an artillery unit that was reestablishing itself, of all places, in the Alamo. So this was a very valuable gun, and not only that, it was newly arrived. It arrived in Velasco in November of that year, along with a group of guys that called themselves the New Orleans Grays. and was hauled up to the Alamo to be part of their artillery defense. After the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexican army, which by the way was refortifying the Alamo during that time, they destroyed the cannon. That is, they spiked the barrel, they knocked the truncheons off of it, and they buried it. Well, there was some rumor that there was treasure in the barrel of the cannon, so it was eventually dug up, and somebody trying to get to the treasure broke the thing all to pieces. A remnant of it stayed in a park in San Antonio for a while, and then it disappeared and is lost to history. So the good people at the Alamo have set about building a replica of that cannon, and it's there, or was the last time I was there, across the street in the place where it would have been during the time of the Alamo for you to see. The 18-pounder was probably built in Sweden, not England, and probably started its life as a 9-pounder that was bored out to 18. So that's the 18-pounder that you hear about in the songs and the stories about the Alamo. One of the controversies that has existed for a very long time is the story about the line in the sand. You know, Daniel has a book about the line in the sand, and most of us revere that story. But the question is, was there actually a line drawn? Well, there are kind of some conflicting stories. Susanna Dickinson, Almarin Dickinson, who was a soldier there, his wife said that she observed a line being drawn, but from where she was, she would have not been able to see it. And then there was a gentleman by the name of Moses Rose, who showed up on the doorstep of a farm family called the Zubers, claiming to have been in the Alamo right before it fell. And he allegedly told about the line in the sand. But again, there is some controversy there. Now, before we are too quick to condemn Moses Rose, you need to know that this was a Frenchman who had been in Napoleon's army and had fought his way across Europe into Russia. So he knew battle. He just didn't have a desire to die. So he got out right before the battle occurred. But whether or not there was a physical line, does it really matter? Was there a line? I don't know. I believe there was. I think it fit Travis' personality. And I've always believed that there was the line in the sand. But whether it was a physical line drawn in the dirt or whether it was a metaphorical line drawn through words, the fact is that these men stayed to the end. They followed their orders. So it was on March the 5th, the cannon fell silent from the Mexican side. For the first time in 12 days, the bombardment stopped. The soldiers in the Alamo and the civilians were exhausted and hungry and dirty after 12 days of battle. Some may have you believe that the Battle of the Alamo was a 12-day picnic by the Mexican army with the Texans being holed up in the Alamo. Not the case. The Mexicans were in a battle, a typical siege battle where they were trenching forward and probing all the time. When I was in the artillery, we had something called harassment fire, that we would lob rounds occasionally over into areas where we knew the enemy would be, just to keep them away. And that's what they were doing, same tactics that we have now. So on March the 5th, those cannon went silent, and perhaps that's when Travis drew the line in the sand. That morning, Santa Anna had had a meeting with his officers and advised them that he was going to assault the Alamo the next day. They advised against it. They knew they had more artillery coming, and they knew it was just a matter of time until the Texans ran out of food, water, and supplies. Santa Anna was determined to defeat these people in the most brutal way. Remember, he had been insulted because General Cross was his brother-in-law. So at midnight, March the 5th, 6th, at midnight, The officers in the Mexican camp roused their soldiers, and they left all of their coats and other equipment behind, taking only their weapons with them. He required that they all have shoes or sandals, and they moved out into position in the darkness. At 5 o'clock the next morning, Santa Anna gave the signal to start the advance. Initially, it was silent, but at some point, one of his soldiers shouted out, "Viva la Santa Anna!" And the silence was broken, and then you heard Duego. The sound of the bugle playing slit throat. No prisoners would be taken. So that's the reason that we reverence the people that defended the Alamo. Now, did it make a difference? I've said in classes and lectures where people say, well, they really didn't delay Santa Anna that much. Yeah, he lost a lot of guys, but it was really only a small fraction of his army. But I look at it this way. While the Alamo was going on, the meeting was going on in Washington, Texas, that gave us a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, and established a provisional government for us. Now, here's another thing that I think of. Some of those units that attacked the Alamo on March the 6th belonged to General Coss, which meant that those units had to have replacements, lots of them. And those replacements would have been green recruits, most likely. That's interesting because at the Battle of San Jacinto, General Coss's troops were on the far right side of Santa Anna's line, and they were the first engaged by Colonel Sherman and his troops. And when they broke into full retreat, they caused confusion everywhere else. So I think it had that effect too, that you had soldiers in those frontline units that were not the best anymore. So I think it did have a dramatic effect in the fact that it gave us time to get organized. Now, some have said, well, Houston used that time to organize an army. Well, not really. He was over talking to the Indians, the Cherokees in East Texas, trying to get that settled down. And he didn't come back to Gonzales until March the 11th, where he found no one else but Colonel Neal and some 300 men that he was organizing to go to help defend the Alamo. That was the nucleus of Houston's army, and he began to build it from there. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you will, with me, remember the Alamo.
Thanks, Charles. We owe a big debt to our forefathers for making Texas the great country that it is. I know you'll do your part in honoring them in our efforts to return Texas to being the great republic that they fought and died for. It was good seeing y'all here today. Please join us again next month, where we'll take another look at this month at the TNM.